Put on your big baggy suits and wide ties. It's time to go back to the 90s with the Solid Signal podcast for the week of April 29th, 2019. I'll admit that this podcast is influenced by a commercial that I saw on the Reels channel where they promised a 2-hour retrospective on the history of Friends. Friends, of course, being the most popular comedy of the 90s and probably the last and most popular comedy ever if you look at the fact that it's still actually making more money on a daily basis than most sitcoms on the air today, and that's in reruns and on Netflix. Friends may have been the biggest hit of the 90s, but between that and ER, it sent NBC into a tailspin that took them at least 10 years to get over, and I think you could argue that they never got over. Let me back up and explain a little bit of how I came to this understanding. The cast of Friends was one of the first casts in the history of television to bargain as a group for salaries, and they did this very effectively as the show continued to be more and more successful. Got to the point where it's in its final season. Every single one of the 6 major actors was earning $1 million per episode in early 2000s money. So think about that. That's $24 million a year for acting on Friends per person. It's my understanding that the cast of ER found out about this, and ER being the most popular drama on TV in the 1990s, and they did the same thing. They started negotiating as a group, and their prices kept going up and up and up. Hey, I'm all for that. I think if you work hard and you're sharp and you've got a talent that nobody else has, make the most of it. I think that's fantastic. But unfortunately, from a business point of view, NBC got stuck. NBC was between a rock and a hard place. They had to pay the actors from Friends and ER because those were the people who were producing for them. On the other hand, they also had to worry about bringing on new shows and trying to develop things that were going to go on, after Friends and ER were done. ER had a particularly long run, something like 16 years, which most people aren't really aware of because they kind of stopped watching it around 1999 or 2000, give or take. But it just kept going on and on and on, partially because NBC didn't have anything better. NBC had done an excellent job of developing its stable of programs on Thursday nights starting in the mid-1980s with a string of hit after hit after hit. It doesn't mean there weren't some misses as well. But we're talking about stuff like The Cosby Show, Cheers, Night Court, LA Law, St. Elsewhere, I think was on Thursdays at one point, although I think it was also on Wednesdays at one point. We're talking about Friends, Mad About You, which doesn't get the credit that it deserves anymore. Seinfeld. The really, really iconic shows of the later part of the 20th century were on NBC. And they were incredibly expensive. And when that cash ran out. NBC was unable to really develop anything to take the mantle after Friends. And they didn't know what to do for years. For years, really. Yes, they did end up finally developing a hit in The Office. And to a lesser extent, Parks and Recreation. They had a little bit of success with Will and Grace, but not up at the Friends level. And I'll argue that they never got up to that level again. Because as Friends was winding to a close, you started seeing cable TV and streaming eventually beginning to take their places and take viewers away from traditional television. NBC went into a nosedive. And really, although they bounced back and there are some hits now, they could only be considered hits in the context of other shows. The best rated shows today would be close to the worst rated shows back in the 1970s or 1980s. The networks just aren't making money like they were. And people are just watching in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places. So they're doing their best. But Friends and ER and other shows that ended up being extremely expensive to produce really hastened the fall of NBC, a network which I picked on pretty mercilessly about a decade ago for having almost nothing to offer, because they did have almost nothing to offer. Today, NBC's biggest hit is the reboot of Will and Grace, which says an awful lot about, whether or not this kind of form can continue. And yeah, they continue to do pretty well with Law and Order, which is now in its 700th year, I think, on the air. But again, that talks about how there really isn't something out there to replace these shows. If we're going to see a real rise from broadcast networks, and I hope we do, because I love broadcasting. I love over the air. It's very important to me, and it's very important to you, and it should be very important to our country. But the networks have to find a way to raise up viewers. Some would argue it should be 4K, something that cable has refused to embrace and that technology makes possible now with the ATSC 3 standards being tested out across the country. Some should argue that more profanity should be allowed, or that there should be some sort of hybrid where shows start out on streaming and move up to the major networks once they have sort of a following. Whatever it is, I don't know. But I will tell you that it's pretty obvious to me that the downfall all started with 6 young people in an apartment that there's no way they could have afforded. And my friends, pun intended, that's the way I see it. That's about it for the Solid Signal podcast. I hope to hear from you in the comments section about what you think about what I have to say. And also, I hope you read things over at blog.solidsignal.com. There's a lot of great content out there. And shop, of course, at solidsignal.com. They're the ones who keep the lights on. Have a great week.